Just getting coordinated here on my end. My apologies. I had a
You're
last
good.
minute snafu with my audio for some reason.
No, you're
Um,
good.
it did an update overnight, and you know how that goes. Can you see my
Right.
screen?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. All right, I am good to go. So I think you wanted to hit record.
Yes, I want to get recorded. I'm good to go.
Perfect. Okay, we're good. All right. We'll have to clip that first part out then. Um, all right. Thanks again, Tim. And hey, Prashant, nice to see you. So yeah, as Tim mentioned, I am Chris Seferlis. I'm an Azure Data and AI specialist. Tim and I were on different manager, but same team up until January of this year when I came over to quote unquote the dark side and more focused around sales and helping customers with overall solutions from more of a sales perspective. And so been around a while, kind of grew up in IT, if you will, went from help desk up to CIO, over 20 years of experience and sort of really think everything in the Microsoft stack, so if it's a Microsoft server, with the exception of probably BizTalk and a couple of others, I've probably installed it or configured it or managed it in some way, shape, or form in my past. Jumped into really embracing data and doing a lot with business intelligence and visualization and all that good stuff about 12 years ago, and really just never looked back because I really enjoyed that ability to put that that results, I guess, if you will, in front of the client, whoever it was, whether it was internal finance or executives or for customers directly. Um, went ahead and got my MBA about 10 years ago. Do a lot of this same stuff, so definitely hit me up on Twitter. Follow my YouTube page. I put some content up there around modern data warehouse and various data topics, some personal development things. Just released one last week on how to become a solution architect if you ever want to. So I'm totally cool with anybody if they want to jump in and ask questions as we go along here. The more interactive and collaborative we can be, I think the better, and the better experience everybody gets out of it. So that being said, though, one thing I do like to highlight is that we may differ in opinion, but really, I'm looking for what that optimal solution is, right? And so I go ahead and recommend anybody who wants to do any presenting ever to steal this slide as I did, because it really plays in a lot, and we see in technology, especially now in the age of the cloud, and how quickly and how rapidly these things advance and change, that it's really hard to or design a solution this year, and expect it to be the same a year from now. So much changes so quickly. Tim and I were actually working with a customer not too long ago that they had a whole architecture built out, and so much had changed in a year's time that it was a completely different design, and we were able to work with their technology challenges in a completely different way. And so it's not something worth arguing over. Let's look at what the best solution is, as opposed to whether you think that this is going to perform better than another, and those kinds of things. We always want to look at cost, we want to look at performance, we want to look at features, and sort of make a collective decision on what works best now and what we know about the future. So now, when we sort of dive in and look at where all this comes from, is we started this journey on the digital transformation. I mean, you can see reference to digital transformation and that that sort of term going back 20 years now, where we start looking at what technology can do for our business and how we can optimize what we're doing from all perspectives, whether it be manufacturing or sales or procurement or finance or whatever. How does technology make us run more efficiently, and how does it help us with customer engagement, and how does it change our businesses, right? We see in the COVID situation where everybody had to move to work from home, and what kind of impact that had on so many businesses, not only from an operational standpoint, but a security standpoint, and just an all-up capability standpoint to be able to continue to do our jobs. So one thing to note that's really dramatic about this is that there are a lot of companies that failed to adopt the digital transformation mindset and moving forward with the technology investment. And so since 2000, 52% of the Fortune 500 companies are just gone. Now, naturally, some of that's through merger and acquisition, but there are quite a few names when you go back and look at that Fortune 500 from 20 years ago that are just completely wiped off the map. And that's kind of scary, and it's kind of crazy to think that there are those companies that just absolutely refuse to embrace technology and realize that in order to move forward, we have to make some of these changes. When we talk about data specifically, which I'm super passionate about, I love talking about data. I am a dataholic. I'm a data hoarder as well. So when we go back, and I was in college in the late 90s, and things like MP3s were coming out, and you started seeing massive adoption of the internet, and all of that kind of stuff. I just became such like I had the digital collection to end all, right, and my first iPod I got in, I think, in 2003 or something like that, and just that ability to have all that digital media on me at all times, and that was certainly a revolution. But now when we start talking about some of the things like social media and a lot of the now, here is our platform, and we're going to give you this information immediately. Our lives are changing from a data perspective because it's coming at us so quickly. I call this the 3 V's of data. I saw one the other day, the four V's of data, where you add veracity of data into here because it can be a little gnarly at times, right? And so when we look at the volume and zettabytes of data, is a common term that gets thrown around, and in the velocity, we need to know what's happening on our shop floor, wherever we're doing manufacturing all around the world, nearly instantly, and what the different types of data that are being thrown at us, in whether it be structured or unstructured, semi-structured, PDFs and log files and social media streams and all that crazy stuff being thrown at us at one time. It just makes our jobs that much more challenging. And really what we need to be able to do is we need to be able to answer 3 questions. The first being, what happened in the past, what's happening right now, and what do we think is going to happen in the future? And in order to answer any of those questions, we need good data. Okay, and let's start focusing more on the data aspect of things as opposed to worrying about what's happening in the underneath systems. Less worry and less focus on our day-to-day management of backups and patching and all that fun stuff that happens behind the scenes. Just talking to a customer yesterday, and we were looking at SQL MI as a possibility to move their application because a couple of years ago when they went up into Azure, IaaS was the only option. And so now we have to circle back and say, okay, can we refit the platform to work with a SQL MI product? And he said it straight out to me. I'm sick of having to worry about managing that hardware and patching it and security updates and all that stuff. It's just a waste of time. I'd rather let somebody else do that and worry about my data being as efficient as it can be and serving the purpose that it's meant to serve as well as possible. So when we move from left to right here, we sort of have that on-premises, and SQL Server 2019 is a fantastic product. We've got a lot of great features in there if you're stuck on-prem, right? We get it. You may need to stay on-prem for a while. There may be that demand or that edict from up above that, no, we're going to stay on-prem with this stuff, and we get it. And so this is, a fully supported product moving forward. Get a lot of questions around some of our products that have been around a long time, the SSIS and the SSRS and those types of products. Those are still being updated. They're still being worked on, adding new features to these things with every release of SQL, and so we want to make sure we're helping to maintain what we call the hybrid architecture, where you've got those workloads you need to run on-prem, and you're going to run it with the latest and greatest with SQL 2019, going into SQL VMs in Azure, where maybe you have some requirement that SQL MI or Azure DB don't fulfill, and so we look at that infrastructure as a service mindset, where we aren't doing as much with the underlying hardware. We're not updating firmwares on RAID cards and firmwares on hard drives and working with SANs in the background and all that, right? And so now we just have to worry more about sort of the OS level and up. And then finally, ultimately, to be the most efficient, we want to move to that platform as a service offering so that we can free up those, those DBAs and those network admins and all those folks that are, kind of just doing those mundane tasks and spinning their wheels on doing that over and over again, and letting them do more exciting things and more fun things, and moving into things like AI and getting better capability and better information out of our data so we can make better decisions. I worked for a CEO for a long time, and he just said, your generation, you guys just want to push a button and have everything done for you. He's dating himself a little bit there, obviously, but my response back to him was, it's not that I want to push a button and have everything done for me. It's that if I have 1% better information or 1% better knowledge about whatever it is that I'm trying to make a decision, that just makes me that much better, right? And so, it's not about having everything done for us. It's about doing things more efficiently and effectively to not only do our jobs, but to remain profitable and move forward and those kinds of things. So when we focus on the business, right, by using a PaaS offering, we get to free ourselves up from worrying about, HA and DR and buying hardware and procuring hardware and software and patching and security and all that stuff, so that we can allow a lot of that housekeeping to be done behind the scenes, and it frees us up to become more efficient, more effective. Now, just like to throw this in there, and to Tim's point, Tim, I'll send you PDF of these slides so you have it and you can share it up to the site. But there's some good links in here, and that's why I like to include them. But if you are considering AWS versus Azure, because that's what the company is deciding that they want to, the direction they want to go, or that's where you're already at, you may want to reevaluate that and look at what we have for capability. We're going to be the most performant platform for SQL, as well as the lowest cost for SQL, as it is our product on Azure. So just be mindful of that when you're making some of those decisions. And then, there was a great study by Forrester on the total economic impact of Azure SQL Database Managed Instance, and we just recently renamed it to SQL Managed Instance, Azure SQL Managed Instance, to clear up any confusion. But essentially, this is a great report that goes through and it shows what a tremendous not only savings but capability to help with those digital transformations as we adopt some of these newer platforms and newer technologies. So definitely worth checking out. That aka.ms in the bottom right-hand corner is the link directly to it. Again, you'll have these slides afterward. And then when we talk about the full offering, the full suite of offers from SQL MI, from Azure SQL Database in general, we go from that sort of singleton database right all the way up into those business critical tiers in SQL MI, and everything in between. Hyperscale, you can get up to 100 terabyte plus of storage if you've got really large databases. Extremely performant and highly available in the business critical tiers, and so depending on what the workload looks like, we evaluate what's going to be the best fit for what you're doing. Now, jumping into just a little more detail about these, right? When we look at our different offerings from sort of the top down, you've got your singleton, where you've got it's really meant for, say, you're running a web app and you want a database in the back end. It's somewhat lighter in features than you would see on SQL on-prem, but a great option because you still have that baseline security and capability that's built into Azure SQL Database. And then if you know you need to be able to run like a multi-tenant environment with an application where the tenant wants their data isolated, you can run something like an elastic pool, which is sort of a collection of singleton databases. You can query across the databases if you need to, and has a little more capability. You can kind of share some resources, you know, and so it saves you a little bit of money and you know, gives you a little more capability. And then right up into the managed instance, which we'll go into greater detail on, but it's you know, it's very close, like for what you're used to managing from a SQL Server everyday situation. And then with this, you have sort of these different tiers where you can run a serverless option. I believe it's still in public preview of SQL Database, where that database, if you have you know, little to no activity over a certain period of time, you can configure it to spin down, so you're not paying for that compute anymore. And then, you know, once you need it, you can send a quick wake up call. It'll wake up in under a minute and have those resources available to, you know, run a workload. So, you know, a good example of something like this is, say you have like an expense report application that doesn't really need to run all month long. You know, and you know, you get a big influx of people that want to use the system toward the end of the month when they're submitting their expense reports, So you have this ability to spin down the database, so you're not using any compute, and you're saving the cost essentially while it's not in use. But then when you do need it, you can spin it up on demand, and it'll be up and running for the team there, and you can set those parameters as to how long it waits to shut down and things like that. So great option there. Then we talk about the hyperscale. We kind of reference that a little bit. We'll get into that a little more here in a bit. And then you've got the two tiers, the business critical and the general purpose tiers, which are, you know, really dependent on your workload. You know, what do you have for SLAs? You know, what do you have for requirements from, you know, even a redundancy or a reporting you know, standpoint from a, you know, whatever is kind of needed. You know, we can tailor fit based on what's required there. And with SQL MI, as I mentioned before, it's very similar to what you'd see when you go to log into your SQL Server on-prem. So you know, with the Azure Singleton database, you don't see things like the SQL agent or you know, SQL jobs, obviously, or database mail and some of those other capabilities. Now, when you spin up an MI, you're spinning up a cluster of SQL servers in the background. You know, depending on which configuration, we'll get into what the architecture looks like here in a little bit. But essentially, you're spinning up a cluster of three. You got the rule of threes with Azure, where you sort of 3 of the disk and 3 of the servers and all that stuff. And you know, you basically are able to connect in just as you would on your SQL on-prem using SSMS or Azure Data Studio or you know, whatever other tools you use. And then, you know, we've sort of done all of the underlying work for you, so you don't have to build your cluster or AOAG or whatever you need. You know, and again, depending on the tier and stuff, you know, we've got a lot of different options there. Really what we found is that MI is best for a customer who's been using you know, an application on-prem and SQL DB hasn't given them enough features for what they need to do with it, and so, you know, they're able to more easily move that workload from on-prem into Azure. You know, migrations are not easy. We're well aware of that. You know, there are definitely challenges to migrations, no matter what the migration is. But we wanted to help make it easier, right? And so offer a lot of capability there to do so. You know, with different migration tools and stuff too that we'll get into. So now looking top down, you know, we kind of talked about this a little bit, right? But when we get into our fully managed service, you know, again, we're spinning up that cluster of SQL servers in the background so that you don't have to build that, right? When you go to build a a SQL MI in your Azure portal is going to take probably somewhere between 3 and 6 hours, last I checked, and that's because it's basically provisioning the hardware for you, setting up the Windows VMs in the background, and setting up the SQL box in the background, and taking care of all that configuration and tuning and all that stuff. So it takes a little while to spin up, but then once you're up and running, adding databases is very, very quick, just like it would be SQL on-prem, and we've got this this notion of SQL pools, or compute pools, instance pools that allow you to provision for additional CPU for usage down the road, and talk about that a little bit here too. But when we talk about moving to MI, we add this compute and storage provision on demand, right? And so you can do quicker scaling. You are to have all the patches and the updates taken care of for you in the background. You've got backups with health checks taken care of for you in the background, and you've got some of the point in time restore features coming, and then some additional features are coming down the pipe. They're on the roadmap, which we will also cover later. We've got the 99.995% availability out of the box, and that was on the previous slide. But if you go business critical tier, you're getting 4 nines and a 5, which is the best for a relational database enterprise level from any cloud vendor. And you're also getting that disaster recovery with single geo. And then you'll have so essentially we'll look at an architecture of that here at the end, but you've got your full MI environment set up, and then you can hang a second MI environment from a completely different region and set it up as basically a full DR good to go in a completely separate region, and it's all built for configuration that way. So you can have 2 MIs in different regions around the world, and then we'll get to multiple regions down the road. So if you need to cover various areas. Also, things got just the things you get built in with Azure, right? So you get the compliance. We're by far and away the most certified from regulatory and governance perspective, right? So we've got far more than the competitor combined when it comes to things like HIPAA and ISO and PCI and all those standards that we want to follow. Obviously, you can go even more strict when you talk about things like Azure GovCloud and those kinds of things, right? We do have the automatic threat detection and automatic alerting for any of those threats. If you're not familiar with things like the SQL database discovery and classification features, on SQL DB, essentially you can go and you can scan your database for something that looks like it could be PII data or credit card data or those kinds of things, and it will do automatic discovery for you, and then send you alerts, when something could be considered PII or financial information or something like that. But then you can also classify those columns so they get extra hardened, if you will. That feature is not yet available in SQL MI. It is available in SQL DB, and it's also available on SQL 2019, but it is on the roadmap for SQL MI for this year. When we talk about the compatibility, right, already talked about the fully fledged tools. So everything you're used to using on-prem today, you can use with SQL MI in Azure. And then one other thing to point out is where it says, fully compatible with SQL Server 2005 plus. So when you get into doing a restore and you want to migrate a database from on-prem, using the Azure Database Migration Service, you can do a live migration or you can do an offline migration, whatever you choose. But you can restore a database backed up from 2005, keep that same versioning when you move it up into SQL MI, and it will, assuming that it meets all of the requirements. We haven't changed the data type and put that to end of life or a certain feature or something like that. It'll do the scan for you using the Azure Database Migration Service. But you can restore backups all the way back to 2005 forward into your MI environment. And then, when we look at some of the features that weren't available, maybe, things like cross-database queries and transactions, because you can have multiple databases within an MI, so you can set those up. You can do linked servers with ODBC. Different other vendors can also be linked servers, connecting into your VNet. It's specific to the different types and the different versions and all that. So if there's questions around that, the documentation covers it pretty well, but it uses an ODBC connection for those linked servers. The .NET CLR modules, Service Broker, CDC. We do have the transactional replication. So if you wanted to use, a pub sub methodology going to a SQL MI box, you can do that. From your on-prem. Some customers will start that way, where they'll replicate up into a cloud box for the first part of the migration, and then when they're ready to cut over, you're fully synced up and you're good to go. The R and Python services actually just got put into private preview. So, we'll probably see those go at least public preview, if not GA by the end of the year. So that was just announced a couple weeks back here. So we're adding in those machine learning services as part of the overall offering. Those are already available in SQL 2019 and SQL DB. And then we get a little more challenged when we talk about distributed transactions and things like file stream, file table, Polybase, which we've rebranded to data virtualization. Those are a little further out. Polybase is in the pipeline, if you will. I'm not sure of timing yet, but it is definitely something that's on the roadmap. Because we do know that is a very exciting feature to be able to reach in and hang external data sets off of our database and be able to run queries off of that. Certainly makes life easy if we don't have to ingest all that data into our database, if it's something that we just need temporarily. But when we start talking about more of the underlying disk-based operations, because we have a cluster that we're not managing, it's being managed for us. We don't have access to that underlying disk space. And so the question becomes, how do we handle that? How do we deal with it? And so that's a little more challenging to set up. I know that there have been certain ways of approaching it thrown around, but there's definitely nothing in concrete there, on how that'll be handled. But, the goal is to eventually come up with the right solution there.
Hey, Chris,
Yes.
there are a couple of questions.
Sure, go for it.
In the chat window. So first one is monitoring at scale SQL performance kind of feature, and is it inbuilt?
Yeah, so it's actually inside the Azure portal. The performance monitoring is part of the portal. So there's intelligent query processing and a lot of configuration capability there. So you can set it up so that it'll do some auto tuning of your queries and indexes, and you can have it so that it'll just notify you that, hey, we've noticed that this query could probably run better if you made this change, and you can have it so it just notifies you. So there's some capability, and it's all managed right through the Azure portal.
Okay. The second question is from Krunal, is about what about multidimensional cubes or SSAS support other than Power BI?
Yeah, so I don't see multidimensional being supported, or I guess added to. It's still being supported, so I want to make sure I use my words carefully there. It is still being supported, but I don't see new features being added to multidimensional going forward. And currently the only way to run multidimensional workloads in Azure is using an IaaS VM. From a tabular model, you can use Azure Analysis Services, obviously. For the most part, that's just a lift and shift. There are very, very few exceptions to where you can take your multidimensional tabular models. Your tabular models from Analysis Services and move them up into Azure Analysis Services, and then of course you can then access those from Power BI as well. But yeah, multidimensional, I don't see that. I mean, it's actually a very rare conversation for me when I've sort of been on the solution architect and sales side of the table for the last 2.5 years. I can only think of one occasion when I've had even a conversation about multidimensional with a customer. So I'm not sure the experience on the CSA team, but certainly not happening nearly as much.
Thank you.
Okay.
That's about it for the time being.
Okay, great. And so then when we start looking at additional features that we never had or I guess might be light in the Azure SQL Database, things like being able to use DMVs and X events and query store. Some of these have come available in the SQL DB since. It originally came out, but obviously SQL Agent and DBMail still are not available in SQL DB, but it is available in SQL MI. And so, and just to make sure I'm clear on that, when I say SQL DB, I'm referring to Azure SQL DB and Azure SQL MI. But you've got sort of the ability here now to use some additional Azure tools. So, we say use OMS instead of MDW for monitoring. Operation Management Suite is, sort of that single pane of glass for all your managing. You can use it for managing virtual machines and app services and databases and all kinds of stuff. And so that's that one interface where you can do a lot of that monitoring. And then, of course, all of the security elements, and these are true across all of our SQL products, right? Things like SQL auditing and row-level security. Things like object-level security are available in some of the SQL products, right? So SQL on-prem and SQL DB and Synapse, formerly Azure SQL Data Warehouse, now SQL Pools in Azure Synapse, all have object level security. We'll get there with SQL MI. That's one gap that we're missing still with SQL MI, but we'll get there. And then dynamic data masking, always encrypted, TDE, all the security elements that we need. And then when we talk about the isolation, right? So just from a very high level, we think about we have our 3 instances because it all comes in the rules of 3, and then you're basically setting up that virtual private cluster of those 3 machines. We're going to wrap that in a VNet. And then from there, we're going to determine what applications we're going to use for the application layer of our stack, right? So you've got your database in the background; it's sitting on its own VNet. We can connect that to a second VNet if we want for something like a web app or an IaaS hosted app. So think of like the old client server model where the server might sit on one machine and the database might sit on another, and you've got your clients accessing that through remote desktop or some kind of remote client or something like that. Similar architecture here, where you're basically isolating the database VNet and using that client server model with your IaaS hosted app. But then you can also have them in the same VNet, but on separate subnets. A SQL MI subnet will not allow internet access. And so it's always on a private subnet internally, with one small exception is that's allow private link. So if we have an Azure-based service or a Microsoft-based service like, say, Power BI, where we want to be able to tap into our SQL MI database in the background, that capability is there. Now, the other thing is if you want to access that environment, say from an on-premises environment or using a private VPN, you can set up those configurations to go into that VNet and be able to connect in. So different architectures, different configurations. Generally, what I see is that you'll deploy a jump box somewhere in this VNet on its own subnet so that you can connect to it from the outside and manage any of the SQL MI. Of course, you can set up that VPN into this VNet and directly connect into that SQL MI using something like Management Studio, SSMS, or something along those lines. But it's all up to how you want to configure it. The capability is there.
All right, Chris, there are a couple of more questions.
Sure.
First one is from Marianne. She's asking, we are trying to move to SQL instance from virtual SQL Server in Azure, but we will lose our SSRS reports that are on the virtual server in Azure. The Power BI server is out of our price range. Is Microsoft going to have any type of reports as a service or scale down reporting capabilities for smaller companies?
My understanding is that that will remain to be a premium service. I've asked the question myself a few times, but my understanding is that paginated reports will remain a premium service, and that the direction for paginated reports is to run an SSRS web front end on a virtual machine, and then you can run the SSRS report manager database in a SQL MI. I'm not sure if that's publicly available yet or not, but it is coming that you can run SSIS and SSRS databases in a SQL MI cluster.
Okay. The next question is from Asmare, and it's asking, can you say a bit more about manage instance ability for cross database query? Is creating external data source required?
Yeah, so remember when you build that virtual cluster, you think of it as an actual SQL instance, right? And that's why it's called managed instance, because you're essentially creating that SQL cluster, which is an instance of SQL Server. So you can hang as many databases off that as you want, and you can do cross database queries across those databases that are installed. Contained within that instance. Now, I am not sure, as I've never done any testing on it, I'm not sure if you can run queries across separate instances. So if you've got, VNet A with an MI box deployed and VNet B with MI box B deployed, if you can query across those. My gut tells me probably not, but I have never tested that.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So now when we go into again, just sort of a different way of looking at how these architectures can be set up. In this case, we have the ability to set up like a peering between our VNets, or having it run on its own subnet. And so when we look at having two separate subnets, so you've got your database subnet on one, and then you've got your application VNet on another. You can run those configurations through a VPN or a peering. You can use ExpressRoute if you're going from on-prem to cloud, those kinds of things. So there's a lot of different capability there. Again, it's what are your performance requirements? What's your SLA? Where do we need to focus our configuration on, right? Because I think pretty much across the board, the rule with computers is you're always going to have a bottleneck somewhere. It's just a matter of, can you make that so that it'll meet your SLA, and it really depends on what that bottleneck is. And so, we look across the scope and figure out what the best configuration is there. And then when we wrong way. And then when we jump into our pricing options, again, wanted to make sure that we highlight, what is possible with SQL MI as we move forward. So, the two different tiers here, you can see that as you sort of work your way down, the biggest impacts here are how large is your database? Do you need a read-only replica? Do you want to run an AOAG, which is what Business Critical is running in the background? Or is it okay running with counting on the Azure storage as your HA in the background? So you're running Azure Premium Storage in the background, and you've got these different nodes, and I've got another slide, I think, with the architecture on that. But in essence, you're relying on the Azure Storage HA as opposed to an AOAG, which you would rely on with Business Critical tier. Now, the other thing to note here is that we start with 4 vCores on compute. I do down the road here. I mentioned that you can run smaller compute sizes, in different configurations for the number of vCores that you're running. But in order to see the 4-core compute options, you have to run the Gen 5 hardware. I think we're starting to push out the Gen 4 and pushing it to end of life, but it still may be an option there in the portal as we start to move along our hardware versions. The old Gen 4 versions, you cannot run a 4-core box. You can only run a minimum of 8-core. So just be mindful of that. If you go to check and deploy something and you're not seeing the 4-core option, make sure you're looking at Gen 5. But then, the other feature that you may need in the business critical tier is in-memory OLTP tables. That's kind of dependent on your specific requirements. This is a great feature that came out in 2014. I don't hear a lot of customers using them, but if you've got the ability to check those out and get some great performance out of the in-memory OLTP tables. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we are going to be more expensive and less expensive and more performant than AWS across the board. One other piece of value here is if you use your Azure Hybrid benefit, which is for an enterprise customer with an enterprise agreement. And the nice thing here is that if you've got software assurance, you can actually use one enterprise core license for 4 general purpose cores. So if you don't necessarily need any of the features of business critical, then you can actually use 4 general purpose tiers for the same price that you've already paid for your enterprise editions for the licensing. Or if you need some of those business critical capabilities, then it's a 1-for-1, and the standard edition is a 1-for-1 with general purpose. So you check out the Azure Hybrid Use benefit, and it also offers quite a bit of savings because you're already licensed for the product on-prem. So why not use those licenses in the cloud? And we also, with some of the newer software assurance benefits, we also announced that you can have a free node in the cloud if you're already licensed for your redundancy purposes. And then from this perspective, really, from the sales perspective and the costing perspective, the other big piece that you may want to look at is reserve capacity. And so this is an ability to basically set up a 1-year or a 3-year contract saying, hey, I know I need this compute for my application. It's not going anywhere. We know we're going to use it for the next 3 years. You can save quite a bit of money if you already have your licensing, plus the reserved instance. You're basically just signing a contract saying, yes, I'm going to use this for the next 3 years, and we'll give you a discount on that. You pay for it as part of your monthly contract fee. You can pay for it up front if you want, but you can also split it out over those months. And if something happens, obviously with COVID, we were kind of put on our heads in a lot of ways, and you have to back off. We do have that ability that our customers do not. Our competitors do not, where you can get out of those contracts. There is a penalty that's associated with it, but our competitors have no flexibility on that, and so something to keep in mind too. Pretty significant cost savings there, as you can see. And the fun stuff. So just to add in some of the newer features, right? They were sort of just included in part of my previous slides, right? So the local time zone, this is something that's been added, the custom instance collation, so if you need a different language collation, or you're running in a different time zone, those capabilities are now there. The public endpoint we mentioned about for Power BI and those kinds of things. The 4 core instances, dev and test, so you can run dev and test boxes in an EA, an enterprise agreement subscription that'll allow you to run a 1 or 2 vCore development box, and really they're designed just for development, but at a much lower cost, and you can run that for development purposes. We do have Azure Active Directory instance logins. We've got failover groups that are available, and then the SQL MI is really its own version of SQL database, right? So it doesn't compare side by side with anything that you would see on-prem. And once you have the ability to certify your database compatibility level, it's not sitting on any version level, if you will. And as you move forward, you are protected against an update breaking your code and those kinds of things. And so you can certify it by using the Database Migration Assistant and the Database Experimentation Assistant to assess your existing database workload. You can keep that compatibility level on target, assuming that you meet all those requirements, and then you can do some testing if you want, for some basic workloads, and depending on what your requirements are internally, a bunch of different tests you can do to verify that it's still going to work. But then once that's certified, then you're protected against any kind of code breakage in the future and things like that for the legacy applications. Talked about the dev test boxes already a little bit. It's a pretty dramatic savings, up to 55% off if you're running dev and test workloads in Azure. And again, you have to set those up through your enterprise agreement for those development subscriptions. Instance pools is one of the newer features that we release, which is very cool, where you can say, okay, I know I want a few different instances and smaller ones for think of your dev, test, and prod environments. So if you do, your prod server is going to need 4 vCores, but you want dev and test for lighter workloads, because we don't need to have the exact same compute environment for our dev and test environments. Now we've got the ability here with instance pools where we're going to say, okay, we're going to buy 8 vCores as opposed to buying, separate instances. We're going to use the instance pool feature so that we can assign our first instance with 4 CPUs and our subsequent instances with 2 each, right? And so those are just sitting there waiting to be used, and it helps with budgeting purposes and stuff like that. So and by doing something like getting instance pool, getting reserved instances in Azure, and knowing that you're going to grow into it, it's going to save you a significant amount of money over time, as opposed to having to spin those up when you need them, and kind of messing with contracts and budgeting and all that kind of stuff. So definitely a very cool feature that we've added recently. And once the instance pool is up and running, you can add that additional compute, and it spins up in 5 minutes because you've already got the hardware spun up and optimized in the background. So you can go ahead and spin up the additional instances very, very quickly. Okay, so now more roadmap stuff. So some of the stuff that we finished up this past year, we kind of talked through that, right? Was there a question?
Yes, this was about TempDB.
Yes, sir.
This question is about why TempDB allocation is limited based on service tier or storage size, and any plan to remove that restriction in the future.
Definitely not an expert on that area. Tim, you'd probably know more about that than I would. But my understanding is that the amount of I guess space allocated for TempDB is basically dictated based on the amount of vCores that you're purchasing.
Right.
And so, as with everything else, whether it be IOPS or memory or whatever, it's all related to the number of vCores that you purchase. And so my understanding is that's going to remain consistent, is that, if you need larger TempDB and things like that, you're not going to have that control, but maybe you've heard differently.
I've not heard a lot on the TempDB sizing aspects per version of managed instance, no.
Yeah. And so, so basically, depending on the amount of vCores that you have, you're only allocated the amount of TempDB you need. Certainly something that you can ask on the user voice page for SQL MI, they have, and it's actually right on the neck. Oh, it's right here, as a matter of fact. So there's a feedback forum for SQL MI where you can add features, feature requests And certainly you can raise that in that forum. And the SQL MI group is definitely a great group to work with, and they answer questions relatively quickly. And so if you want to post that question in there, if it already hasn't been posted, and maybe an answer in there as to how they plan to address that going forward.
Cool. Thanks. That's a good answer. And another question is it possible to have a backup from MI and then send it to an on-prem version of SQL Server to be used on-prem? I don't think so, right, Chris?
No. You'd have to do something like like a backpack type setup, where you're just basically dumping all of the data and the schema out. There's no way to restore an MI version on-prem. And again, my understanding is that there never will be, because SQL MI is its own version of SQL. It's hard to say never, right? I hate to use absolutes, but I'd say it's very unlikely that we'll ever have something that's compatible on-prem.
Right.
Okay. So that's
just a follow up to that. What about transactional replication from MI to on-prem?
Nope. You can go from you can go from prem to MI, but you can't go from MI to prem. I don't know. I don't know if that will ever change, but I know that you can only go one way right now.
Gotcha. All right. Thank you.
Sure. So I think that covers all of the things that we came out with in this past year. So now let's get into the new fun stuff that we're coming out with. So the hyperscale, which is one of the bigger features that has been requested for MI, because when we start talking about those application migrations and the larger data sets, hyperscale is one of the ones that is really, really sought after. So now I believe that is either in private preview, or private preview will be out in the next quarter. I think it's next quarter, sometime in Q3, that we're expecting hyperscale in private preview. Work with your Microsoft teams to find out, and they can get you, better information about that, more specific timing and things. And the other thing to ask too is if you need more than 100 terabytes, that is also something that they can work with as well. I know that if you work with the product team for larger workloads, that they can help you with that as well. So MI Q3 for private preview, and then probably GA, I would say the first half of 2021. Data virtualization, which is that Polybase that we talked about. These are heavy on the roadmap. Python and R, like I said, that's now in private preview. Distributed transactions between SQL MI instances. Now that's not going to go outside of MI instances, but between MI instances is on the roadmap. I mentioned earlier the hosting for SSRS databases and SSIS deployments, so that you can use your SSIS DB for, if you're using SSIS hosted integration runtimes with your data factory jobs. That database can eventually here be deployed to MI. Let's see, some more tweaks around availability, so maintenance policies, accelerated database recovery. If you haven't seen accelerated database recovery, it's now available in SQL 2019. Do a quick YouTube search for accelerated database recovery for SQL, and it's outstanding how quickly you can just recover terabytes of data. We're talking in minutes. I don't remember the exact amount, but it was something like a 50 terabyte database was restored in like 9 minutes or something like that. And but yeah, go check that out. That's a really cool thing. Long-term backup retention. Now, this is going to be something that you can configure within the portal itself. But one thing to keep in mind about SQL MI is that because you have the ability to do backups and restores as part of SSMS, so in your query windows, you can actually do a backup and restore of your MI environment within MI, right? So back to the question that was asked about doing backups, you can actually do an offline backup, out of band backup, if you will, to blob storage. And we'll get into that real quick on how you do that. I know we're coming close to time here. But it's all done through the SSMS window, and you can point it directly at an ADFS box. I'm sorry, not an ADF. Data lake store, storage container in Azure. Let's see what else. Instance aliases, so you can change the names of, or you can alias the names of your instances for readability purposes, service endpoint policies, global peering, heterogeneous resources. So more features coming out. We hope to see this calendar year. Migrations, let me just burn through some of this stuff real quick. So just when we look at the migration path, right, direct SQL to MI, if we can get that to work, if there aren't any restrictions, if you're using SSIS and you want to run that in the cloud, you can run SSIS in Azure Data Factory, or you can migrate those jobs to Data Factory. SSAS tabular will go to Azure Analysis Services. If you're running multidimensional, you're going to have to run that in an Azure virtual machine. SSRS again, you can use paginated reports. You can load those RDL files directly into the Power BI Premium service. If it is too costly or there are limitations to that service, you'd have to run an SSRS box in Azure. Azure Database Migration Service, talked about this a little bit. You can migrate databases directly from other database providers as well as SQL directly into SQL. And there's a service that can do that assessment for you to begin with. Your typical migration process, right? You do that assessment, you do the discovery on your environment, you do the actual migration, and then after you're done with the migration, you do the optimization, and then you run any additional features on top of that. So backups real quick. We've got the notion of copy only backups to cut down the time it takes. Transactional logs are backed up every 5 to 10 minutes. Full databases are weekly, and differentials happen every few hours. And it's just totally based on what the workload is on those servers. We obviously don't want to slow down production by doing a backup or a transaction log backup. So it's just totally dependent on what the compute that's being used. Restores, same thing. You can do SSMS. You cannot do an automated backup restore with SSMS. You can do those from the portal, but you can do restores if you've backed it up to a blob storage somewhere or something along those lines. Just want to show 2 more slides here. So basically, we looked at the architectures, right? And so your Azure storage accounts are what's handling the HA using on the general purpose tier, but then in the business critical tier, it's an AOAG, and you can see the differences between those. So if you needed that read-only replica for, say, SSRS reports or something like that, that's how you could set that up. And finally, the failover groups with the managed instance, right? And so there's a great video. So the link down below works, and like I said, I'll share these. But there's a great video that kind of shows you step by step how to set this up. You basically you'll set up your first MI in whatever region your primary region is. When you go to set up your second MI, it gives you the option to say this is a secondary region. And so forth and so on, and it kind of walks you through that whole thing. A whole bunch of links and resources for different stuff, ARM templates, blogs about all this stuff, all that good stuff, and I am done. I apologize for going over.
Nope, no problem. Good job, man. I still have a couple questions. Can I shoot them to you?
Yeah, I'm good. No, I mean, if you guys want to stick on, I'm okay to answer them right now. If you're good.
Sure. So how can we do a quick failover for AGs and MI without using any APIs?
So you essentially, are you talking about, does it say like failover from one region to another, or is it within the same region? Does it say?
The questioner didn't specify between AGs in the same region.
You can't. There's no way to force that. There's no control over it. So essentially, it has to do its own thing. Once the monitoring cluster notes that there's a failure of some sort, it'll automatically fail over and then fail back.
Gotcha. Then another question, see backups with private master key, TDE is still not supported. Any plans to support in the future?
I don't know about private master keys. If you want to send me the question directly, my email's on the screen, and
Sure.
I can try to get an answer on that. TDE is supported, or is that specific to the backup? My understanding is, wait, maybe I misheard that. Is it the private key on the TDE backup? Is that what they're asking?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I'm not sure about that one. I'm kind of surprised because I thought we were allowing personal keys on that stuff.
Right.
But yeah, send me the email, please, whoever that was, and I'll do some digging.
Cool. That's going on. Any other questions, guys?
Shout them out. I got time.
All right. Oh, last question. Will the Patriots go back to stinking now that they lost their deflate golden boy? Huh? Wonder who sent that.
I got a feeling I know who that came from, and let's just say that I am a Tampa Bay fan now.
I know. See, I'm a Jameis Winston fan, and wherever he goes, I'm a fan of. So
I'm
not a Tampa fan.
I might have lost a little bit of respect for you, Tim. I'm sorry. I'm a Florida fan, and I am not a Winston fan.
Well, I'm a Florida State grad, so I.
Oh, there you go. All right. Well, so you got a little more legitimacy too.
A little bit more. That's right.
All
Well,
right.
hey, Chris, thanks for the great session.
Yeah.
And thanks. You had about 30 people in attendance here, so that was really good. And we're going to go ahead and stop the recording. And everybody, go have a good weekend.
Thanks. Have a great weekend. Thanks for having me, Tim. And this was fun. Definitely, if anybody has any other questions, feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much, Chris.
All right. Thanks all.
Bye,
Take care.
everybody.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.